Most people know the Human League for their album Dare, the polished synthpop sound, the success. But just before that, there was a very different band. Across Reproduction and Travelogue, they were building something colder, more experimental, a sound that felt completely new at the time. But within that sound, two very different ideas were starting to emerge, and by 1980 it was becoming clear that they could not continue in the same way. Because this was not just the sound before Dare, this was the sound of a band already beginning to pull apart. To understand that moment, you have to go back to how it all started. At the end of the 1970s in Sheffield, this was not a band built around guitars or traditional songwriting. It began with Martin Ware and Ian Craig Marsh, both experimenting with synthesizers at a time when the technology was still relatively limited and often unreliable. These were not instruments designed for easy songwriting. They required patience, technical understanding, and a willingness to accept imperfections. That in itself shaped the sound. They were not trying to imitate rock music. In fact, they were actively moving away from it. The late 1970s had been dominated by guitars, whether in punk or in more traditional rock forms, and what Ware and Marsh were exploring felt like a break from that entire history. Their early recordings were built on repetition, texture, and atmosphere rather than performance in the traditional sense. It was music that felt modern in a way that was not immediately comfortable. Into this came Phil Oakey. He was not a trained singer, and he had not been part of a band before. But he had a look and a presence that stood out. And more importantly, his voice provided a contrast to the machines. Where the electronics were rigid and controlled, Oakey brought something human, even if it was often delivered in a detached, almost understated way. That balance between human and machine would become one of the defining characteristics of the band. From the beginning, they stood slightly outside everything else happening at the time. They were not quite part of the punk scene, even though they emerged from the same period. They were not pop, and they were not aiming to be. And the term synthpop had not yet fully taken shape. What they were doing felt like it existed in its own space. Their early single, Being Boiled, released in 1978, made that clear. It was minimal, repetitive, and thematically unusual, with lyrics inspired by silk production and ethical concerns rather than conventional subject matter. Even by the standards of the time, it stood apart. It was not designed to be a hit, and it did not behave like one. But it established a direction. That direction carried into their debut album, Reproduction, released in 1979. The title itself suggests something mechanical, something repeated rather than performed, and that idea runs through the entire record. The sound is rigid, sometimes deliberately so, built around early synthesizers that did not allow for easy expression. Tracks often feel structured around patterns rather than progression, and there is a sense of distance in the way the music is presented. But within that, there are moments where something else begins to appear. Not fully formed, but present. A stronger sense of melody, a clearer structure. Hints that this approach could evolve into something more accessible without losing its identity. Those moments are important because they point toward a direction that not everyone in the band was equally interested in following. By the time Travelogue was released in 1980, the band had developed further. The sound was still electronic and still experimental, but it was more confident. There is a greater sense of control in the arrangements, and the album feels more cohesive as a whole. It is also more varied, with moments that are more immediate alongside those that remain distant and abstract. Importantly, Travelogue also brought the band closer to a wider audience. It entered the UK charts, which suggested that this type of music could reach beyond a small experimental scene. That in itself raised questions about what the band could become. And this is where the internal dynamics begin to matter more. Because what you are hearing across these two albums is not just musical development. It is the presence of two different ways of thinking about what this band should be. For Martin Ware and Ian Craig Marsh, the original idea was still central. Electronic music is something distinct from pop, something that did not need to follow established structures or expectations. There was a belief in maintaining that identity, even if it limited wider success. For Phil Oakey, the situation was slightly different. As the voice and visual center of the band, he was also the point of connection for listeners. And as the music began to show signs of becoming more accessible, that connection became more important. Not necessarily as a conscious shift at first, but as something that naturally developed from the role he occupied within the band. These differences were not immediately confrontational, but they were present. And as the band moved forward, they became harder to reconcile. There were also practical realities. Touring, recording, and working within the expectations of a record label all placed pressure on the group to define what they were and where they were going. Despite critical attention and support from figures like David Bowie, who was known to admire the band's work, commercial success remained limited. That created a situation where change was not just an artistic question, but also a practical one. By late 1980, after the release of Travelogue, the situation reached a point where it could no longer continue in the same way. Martin Ware and Ian Craig Marsh left the Human League. This was not the result of a single event, but of a gradual divergence in direction. They would go on to form the band Heaven 17, a project that continued many of the ideas present in the early Human League, but developed them in a different way. Meanwhile, Phil Oakey remained with the name and faced a very uncertain future. At that point, there was no guarantee that the Human League would continue at all. The version of the band that had created Reproduction and Travelogue had effectively come to an end, and what remained was not a continuation, but a reset. What makes this moment so significant is what followed. Oakey rebuilt the band with new members, including Joanne Catherall and Susan Ann Solly, and began moving toward a more structured and accessible sound. This was not a complete rejection of the past, but it was a clear shift in direction. Within a relatively short time, that new version of the band would create Dare, an album that, on the surface, feels very different from what came before. Warmer, more immediate, more connected to a wider audience. But if you listen closely, elements of the earlier work are still there. The use of electronics, the sense of precision, the balance between human and machine. The difference is how those elements are used. And that is why the early albums still matter. Not just as beginnings, but as a foundation. Reproduction shows the band establishing a language. Travelogue shows that language becoming more defined. And the tension between different ideas of what that language should become ultimately leads to a transformation that would not have been possible otherwise. Because sometimes the breakthrough is not where the story begins. It is where everything that came before finally finds its form. And in the case of the Human League, that form was shaped just as much by what did not last as by what did.